Here we're going to talk about cardiac output, which is essentially the amount of blood that is pumped out by a ventricle per unit of time or per minute. So, amount of blood ejected from a ventricle per minute. Okay. And the amount of blood is usually in liters. Okay, so remember that our cardiac output is the amount of blood that's ejected from the ventricle per minute. And so that means that we have to look at the number of cardiac cycles per minute, which is our heart rate. Okay, and then we have to take and multiply that by the amount of blood that is pumped out per cardiac cycle, which we call our stroke volume. Okay, so stroke volume is equal to the amount of blood ejected from a ventricle per cardiac cycle or per one heartbeat, right? And then, so we take the amount of blood ejected during a single heartbeat, multiply that number of beats per minute, and that will give us the amount of blood ejected per minute, which is our cardiac output, okay? But then how do we calculate our stroke volume? Okay, so our stroke volume is the amount of blood that is ejected per cardiac cycle. So we have to know how much blood was in there before the ejection and how much blood was in there after the ejection. So the stroke volume is equal to something that we call the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. So end diastolic volume is how much blood was in the ventricle at the end of ventricular diastole. So when the ventricles are done relaxing, how much blood is in there right before we start to pump it out. And then our end systolic volume is how much blood is in there after ventricular systole, so after we pump that blood out. So basically we're saying how much was in there at the start and how much is in there once we're done. So if we take that, that gives us our stroke volume, okay? So that leads us to something else, okay? So our end diastolic volume is essentially controlled by how much blood is actually returning to the heart, which we call venous return, okay? So remember that we have an atrium, okay? And then we've got a very large ventricle, so we're going to do it like this. Okay, now then remember that our ventricle pumps out into a vessel. Okay, so we've got a valve here, that's our atrioventricular valve, and then remember we've got our SL valves here between the ventricles and the chamber. Okay, so blood is going to come back, it's going to get returned into the atria, and it's going to flow down into those ventricles. So as it flows into the ventricles, remember that atria are going to contract during atrial systole, and that's going to force blood down into the ventricles. And that's going to cause the walls of the ventricles to stretch a little bit. Stretching is, remember, good. Just like in skeletal muscle, there's elastic filaments in there. So the elasticity is going to give us some more force. Okay? So that degree of stretch caused by that venous return is something that we call preload. Okay? Now, remember that we also have blood inside of here, and that exerts a force down this way. Now, as the ventricles contract, right, they have to contract enough to exceed this force here. The amount of resistance that this provides is something that we call the afterload. Okay? And these two factors, both our preload and our afterload, are going to affect these two values up here, our end systolic volume and our end diastolic volume, right? So what do you think is going to happen if I increase afterload? I increase this resistance. It's going to take me more pressure to start that ventricular ejection phase, which means I'm not going to get to eject as much blood. So I'm going to increase my end systolic volume. I'll have more blood left over. that means it's going to decrease my stroke volume. And that's going to do what to my cardiac output? It's going to decrease my cardiac output. So hypertension, like increased blood pressure, right, will cause a decrease in our overall stroke volume, which causes a decrease in our cardiac output. Okay? Now, there is a very special law that sort of looks at this sort of stuff, and this is known as the Frank-Starling law. And the Frank-Starling law basically says that our stroke volume is proportional to the end diastolic volume. It's dictated off of that preload. So as we increase end diastolic volume, we increase the stretch on those ventricular cardiomyocytes, and that's going to increase our stroke volume. So we can sort of take a look at this, and we can do so by graphing the end diastolic volume, okay, with cardiac output. Okay? And what we can do is we can graph two things. We can graph our overall cardiac output, okay, and we can graph our venous return on that. So I'm going to graph cardiac output in red. Right, and so we can say cardiac, as end diastolic volume goes up, cardiac output goes up, and then it starts to level off like so. Now, if I were to map venous return, right, under normal conditions, sort of looks like this, and then as end diastolic volume goes up, venous return comes down because we're leaving blood in the ventricles, right? So that's essentially decreasing our end systolic volume, right, which is going to increase our end diastolic volume, right? So that's going to bring that venous return back down because we're not pumping as much blood out. Okay, so this is known, where these two cross, this is known as the operational point of the heart. Now, what we can do is we can modify these graphs a little bit by changing a couple of different things. We can change the contractility of the heart. We can decrease contractility of the heart, and it looks something like this. Okay? Or we can increase contractility of the heart, and it looks something like this. Okay? So this is basically changes in the contractility or contractile force of the heart. So if we increase the contractile force of the heart by doing something like, let's say, sympathetic innervation, right, what's going to happen is that is going to impact the cardiac function, right, or the operating part of the heart, where how much venous return there is, right? So if we sort of shift it, we change the venous return. So we increase the amount of venous return that we have, right? We decrease our end diastolic volume, though, in doing so, right? We can also change the venous return in certain ways. So we can decrease venous return, right? Or we can increase venous return. Right? And the ways that we can sort of do this is by changing things like blood volume. So if I increase my blood volume, that would be like this over here, increase blood volume. Right now, what I'm doing is I am changing the operating point of the heart. Right? So if I increase my blood volume, right, now I'm going to modify or move my cardiac output. Right? So this right here is known as a cardiac function curve. Right, so write that down. This is a cardiac function curve. And this was all established based off of a very simplistic sort of understanding of how the heart works under the Frank-Starling law, which basically says that by modifying our end diastolic volume, we are going to change our stroke volume. So your thinker at the end of this video, right, is to think about what happens if I change heart rate. Right? How does a change in heart rate impact our cardiac output? And does a change in heart rate always change cardiac output the same way?